At this point, we transition to our featured speaker and program. To introduce our speakers in a moment, I'll invite club member Eric Christensen with classification and law practice to the podium. A couple of fun facts about Eric. He joined Seattle 4 in October 2013. His dad was a 56-year Rotarian as well as a leading conservationist in Idaho. Eric's father convinced him to join Seattle 4 by sharing a copy of the Rotary magazine highlighting our club and including a bit about the long history of public service here in Seattle. Eric chairs our Seattle Rotary Environmental Sustainability Committee. Eric, thanks for your leadership both in Seattle 4 and in our region. During our Q&A segment for the speaker, club member Dennis Williams with classification, financial planning, and wealth management will be our roving microphone handler in the ballroom. Club Sergeant at Arms for the day, John Steckler, will recognize the Zoom chat questions and present them on behalf of our Zoom participants. Now to introduce today's main program, Eric Christensen.
Good afternoon. As chair of the club's Environmental Sustainability Committee, I want to wish everyone a happy Earth Day. If you haven't done so already, I urge you to sign the Climate Pledge because small actions by all of us will make a big difference, but if we all wait for the other guy to take action, we'll make no difference. For this year's Earth Day program, it's my pleasure to introduce Seattle's own Dr. David Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington. He specializes in geomorphology, which means he studies geological processes of interest to all of us who live here in Puget Sound, such as the evolution of mountains, glaciers, volcanoes, earthquakes, and rivers. He has a nearly endless list of academic publications and awards, which notably includes receiving a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Dr. Montgomery has also published a number of books for lay audiences on a wide range of topics, ranging from Noah's flood to salmon to Puget Sound River restoration, and several books on today's topic, soils. The newest book will be published in June, and I urge you to attend the event on June 21st at Town Hall Seattle when the book will be published. So, Dr. Montgomery.
Great. Eric, thank you very much, and thank you for letting me interrupt your lunch with some thoughts about what I've been doing nights and weekends for the last 15 years in terms of writing books for not my colleagues. And it turned out that I quite enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun. Basically, what I'm going to be speaking about is something that wraps around the concept of what I call the fifth revolution, the fifth agricultural revolution. If I was speaking for an hour, I'd tell you about the first four, but I'm not going to because I only have 20 minutes. The books that are up there on the screen are the three that precede the one that's coming out in June. Dirt is one that looks back at the history of how the way people treated their land affected how the land treated that society's descendants. And the summary of that book is pretty short. If you don't take care of the land, you don't last, at least not on a scale that a geologist considers significant. In terms of the middle book, it's one I co-authored with my wife, Ann Baclay. She's a biologist. I'm a geologist. What do you get when you put biology and geology together? Soil. That's sort of the interface between what we look at. And that tells the story of how she restored the soil in our yard. I'll show you the fruits of her labor today in a minute. But suffice it to say that looks at the science behind the role of microbes and the health of plants and what's going on in our own gut and why those systems are the same just inside out relative to one another. The third book, Growing a Revolution, that caps off what we call our Dirt Trilogy, looks at taking the lessons of that first book, the science in the second book, to ask the question of could we actually reverse the degradation that has happened on using economically viable, highly productive farming methods. And if the answer was no, I'd probably be hiding in my basement drinking scotch for the rest of my life. But no, I've turned into a bit of an optimist. But we've spent a lot of time in the last 10,000 years degrading land, turning verdant land, as shown on the left, into desertified landscapes or degraded land. And that's a story that is not just one of past civilizations, as I wrote about in Dirt. If you look at the UN's Global State of the Soil survey from just a few years ago, they concluded that we're losing, the global us, humanity, is losing about 0.3% of our ability to feed ourselves each and every year, cumulatively, due to ongoing soil loss, the erosion of the soil, and soil degradation, the reduction of its fertility. Now, 0.3% doesn't sound like a really big number until you start thinking over century timescales, and then you start to realize that, wow, we're on track to lose a third of our ability to feed ourselves, where our population is supposed to go up by about a third to 50% by the end of this century. It's a problem that needs to be addressed quite seriously. And unfortunately, at the policy level, that really hasn't happened yet. But that's an even longer diatribe than my 20-minute talk today. So Dirt is a book that looks backwards through history, looking at how societies that treated their land lasted or didn't. And what you find when you look at it back through the archaeological record, through this, looking at the soils in different regions of the world, and just looking at where societies are prosperous and impoverished today, there's a legacy of how people treated their land. And soil erosion and degradation played a documented role in the demise of ancient civilizations from Neolithic Europe, classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States. I sort of cataloged them all in the Dirt book, as my seminar students kind of say, it's the same story in each society. And I go, right, you get it. There's a common thread in terms of how people treated their land. And that thread is rooted in something you might not suspect, a villain called the Plow. I didn't really think that a nonfiction book could have a villain, but the more I sort of researched the state of the world's soils and the effects of past societies, I realized that the problem wasn't so much the deforestation that you read about in environmental history textbooks, it was the plow that followed. And why was that? Because think about what a plow does. It inverts the earth, it inverts the soil, it makes it really good for killing weeds. But it makes it really good for killing worms, for killing mycorrhizal fungi, for killing life in the soil as well. Think about if somebody took a giant spoon, took the roof off your house, and stirred all your stuff up once a year. Would you move? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the problem with the plow is it allowed soil erosion to proceed faster than soil building and to do it year after year. And it's, soil is like humanity's bank account. It's the capital, it's the natural ecosystem capital we use to finance our civilization, to feed ourselves, the down payment for being able to have electricity and professors and all those other useless things that we have that some of us enjoy. But so how fast are the world's soils eroding? That number up on the top in red is the number I got from summarizing the data from 1,400 studies that I pulled out of the UW library back when I was writing Dirt. 1.5 millimeters a year is the average rate of topsoil loss off contemporary farms. 1.5 millimeters sounds like a slow rate, right? Your fingernails grow faster than that. But at that pace, you can lose an inch of fertile soil in 20 years, just a couple decades. So the relevant next question is, how fast can nature fix the damage? How fast do soils form? That's what that scary blue number is. 2% of a millimeter a year under natural conditions, averaged globally. Your yard, your farm may vary. But the difference in those, the red and the blue numbers, 2 orders of magnitude. That's the problem. We're losing faster globally, far faster than we're replacing it. And that has happened and plagued society after society in the past. And I've just given you all the data that it takes to calculate for yourselves in the back of your napkin how fast you think, how long you might suspect an agricultural civilization should stick around. Because that net soil loss of about 1 millimeter a year, and that's conservative given the numbers that I'd showed you, which are defensible global averages, it would only take about 500 to 1,000 years to erode off 1.5 foot to 3 foot thick soil, 1.5 meters to 1 meter thick soil. And that turns out to be approximately the lifespan of most major civilizations, agricultural civilizations, with a few exceptions that I hope you're sitting there going, but Dave, what about the Nile in Egypt? What about the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Middle East? What about the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, or the big rivers of lowland China? Those are places where people have farmed for thousands of years. How did they do it? Well, there's a geography at play there. Those are all big river floodplains. And we all know what happens on a floodplain, right? It's hidden right there in the name of it. It floods. And what does a flood bring? Silt, sand, clay, tires, tractors, Russian tanks, I don't know, whatever is basically swept down the river. But that is a geography that nature can replenish itself in. It's when farming practices move out of floodplains and human populations grow to depend on them that the clock starts ticking. So the exceptions are the ones that kind of prove the rule. And the problem with land degradation is not just the loss of the soil, but it's also turning soil like that brown stuff on the left of the screen into the khaki stuff on the right. Those are 2 soils from neighboring farms in North Carolina, where some of my ancestors left in the Civil War times. But the brown stuff on the left is soil from a farm that was abandoned in the mid-19th century in the first depopulation of that region when the soil was degraded in a way that relates to the Civil War that I won't go into explaining today because it's too much for 20 minutes. But the point being that khaki stuff on the right is the same parent material. It's the same, soil developed on the same stuff in the same climate. The difference is how people treated it for 100 years. Any gardeners out there want to actually garden with the stuff on the right rather than the stuff on the left? No. Why? Because that darker stuff has organic matter. It's richer, it's more fertile, it's better soil, and every farmer knows it. And if you look at what we've done in terms of soil organic matter, which translates into soil carbon, soil organic matter is about 50%, well, 40% soil carbon, almost half. There's a paper that came out just a couple years back that argued that the soil organic matter content, the amount of carbon in our agricultural soils, has decreased by 50% across North America on average since the advent of colonial agriculture. We've run the batteries on America down by 50% in just a couple centuries. Think what the Greeks and Romans could have done with a 1,000-year run at their landscapes. They actually really did a number on it. And that's all stuff I talk about in the Dirt book. That concludes the depressing part of this talk. I'm going to try and swiftly move into the optimistic part, because I actually have become an optimist on this problem lately. Is soil restoration possible? That's the question I grappled with after finishing Dirt. Could we actually reverse the historical pattern? And I really started to become an optimist when I was looking over my wife's shoulder at how she transformed the soil in our yard when I got tenure at UW and we bought a house in North Seattle. And I married a gardener, and we had a lot that just had 6 inches of old growth lawn, and we pulled that lawn off, and there was no worms, there was no life in the soil. We had dirt like that khaki stuff I just showed you. And basically, over the course of a little more than a decade, turned that stuff on the left-hand side of the screen into the stuff on the right. The stuff on the left's the soil we started with, about 1% organic matter. The stuff on the right's what we have now, about 10% organic matter. The garden has turned into a little urban paradise. Life came back to the yard when we restored fertility to the land, to the soil. And what did it take? Not disturbing it, feeding the soil organic matter, and cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, feeding the soil life. Which is exactly the thing that was left out of agriculture in the 20th century. In seeing the dramatic ability of my gardener wife to, what do I do in the garden? I do whatever she tells me. She is the brains behind turning that khaki stuff into that dark stuff. And it's all about soil biology. And it's not a big mystery. But we started asking the question of how much it would take to actually turn the problem in agriculture around, to actually use the science behind all the microbial ecology that Ann was employing in the yard to actually rebuild the fertility of farms around the world. And that's what I wrote about in Growing a Revolution. And to do that, I took about 6 months off from my day-to-day activities at UW and interviewed farmers around the world who had done to their farms what Ann did to our yard, who had restored the fertility of their land, taken degraded, worn-out land and rebuilt it into very productive land. And what did they actually share in common? See, my job is to go and listen, to figure out, what the farmers that had done it actually did, and then stand back. And you might not be surprised how many of those farmers told me, well, you're the first academic that actually showed up and listened, instead of telling them how to do it. So what I basically found is that there were all the farmers that I visited who were very successful at this style of regenerative or soil building agriculture involved minimal or no disturbance to the land. They were not plowing. They were practicing no-till agriculture. They maintained a permanent ground cover on their land, and they planted cover crops, and they used diverse crop rotations. They were not just growing corn and soybeans. Many of them were growing corn and soybeans, but they also grew wheat and oats and rye and other things in a rotation, 5, 6 or more crops in rotation. And why does this work to rebuild soil fertility? Because it feeds, houses, and cultivates beneficial communities of organisms in the soil. And what can it do to soil on farms? This is another example from a farm in Ohio. The soil labeled 1971 is the soil that the farmer started with in the early 70s. The one labeled 2014 is the soil he ended up with on the same piece of land, the same farm, in 2014 after he adopted practices that followed those principles. And this is another slide of a similar soil from North Dakota, actually at the farm of a gentleman that I'm going to be speaking with tonight in Boise on this same issue. The soil he's holding up is the one that was farmed regeneratively in that style of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and diversity. The one on the left is from the neighbor's organic farm. There's nothing wrong with the neighbor's organic farm, but the guy doing the other things who isn't an organic farmer has actually built his soil up to be more fertile. And he's done it over the course of just a couple decades. So what are the benefits of restoring health to the world's soils? Higher farmer profits, and how does that work? Because they're able to grow, once you restore fertility to your land, you can achieve comparable yields to what people are getting with conventional farms. And it uses less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less fossil fuel. What are the three big expenses on North American farms? Fertilizer, pesticide, and fossil fuel. If you can grow as much and your income is the same and your expenses are cut in half or more, you're a more profitable farmer. This is why I turned into an optimist on this issue, because I think agriculture is a really good example of how environmental and economic interests can align for the betterment of humanity. So this is why a geologist would spend nights and weekends for 15 years thinking about and working on and writing about this subject. It also means more carbon in the soil. What's the best way that has ever been invented to pull carbon out of the atmosphere? It's called photosynthesis. And a lot of that carbon can end up back in the ground if we farm right. Now, is it going to solve the climate problem? No, the numbers don't pencil out for that. Could it help in a big way? Absolutely. The numbers definitely pencil out for that. Could also, the best way to reduce off-site nitrogen pollution and nitrate problems in wells is to use less soluble nitrogen on farms. And that is what regenerative farming allows farmers to do. But what I haven't talked about here yet is the part that actually comes closest to our own individual lives, and that's our own health. So Ann and I have our new book that's coming out in June, and yes, I invite you all to come to the event at Town Hall on the 21st of June. It's going to be a great party. It took 4 years to write the book. We are definitely going to blow off some steam. But what we focused on in this book is the question that I haven't addressed yet today, and that's, what does it mean for our health? What does it mean for what's in our food and how that might affect human health? As part of that, we dug into the scientific literature, we researched a whole bunch of stuff. We also did a comparative study of 10 farms, actually 20 farms, 10 pairs of farms across the United States, where we got a regenerative farm that had been farming according to those principles I was just talking about for at least 5 or 10 years, and compared them with a neighboring farm on the same kind of soil, where we had them grow the same crop, and then we tested their soil and we tested their crops, and then we looked at the comparisons. The little bars on the left shows you the differences in the percent soil organic matter. Think of it as just soil carbon. And the takeaway is that blue box is higher than the red box. There's more carbon in the regenerative soils, and the mean difference is about 2. We basically can show that regenerative farming increased the organic matter content of the topsoil by roughly a factor of 2. And it was varied from almost no difference to up to like a 7-fold difference, farm by farm. This is a preliminary, small data set, by no means conclusive study, but it's an eye-opener in terms of the way regenerative practices can put carbon back in the ground. The little bar graphs on the right-hand side, also with the blue one, the regenerative one, higher than the conventional one, the red one, that shows you this test for soil health. So the soil on the regenerative farms had more carbon, more organic matter, and more microbial activity. It was healthier soil. What did the healthier soil actually mean for what was in the crops? This is where we get, I think, some really interesting connections, because what Ann and I did in writing What Your Food Ate, the new book, is we looked at the connections between soil health and crop health and livestock health and human health, and crop health and human health for those of us who don't eat livestock or animal products. There's a lot of science that connects all those things like beads on a string, but in this test that we did with these 10 neighboring farms, we found that vitamins K, C, E, and B1 were 15 to 34% higher in the regenerative crops on average. There's a lot of variability, as you might imagine there would be, and that's why we labeled the study preliminary. It needs a lot more work, but there's some interesting results. The carotenoids, phenolics, and phytosterols down there at the bottom that had a 15 to 22% difference, more in the regenerative crops. What are those things? They're called phytochemicals, chemicals that plants make. Those are also known as antioxidants, anti-inflammatories. There's a ton of medical research that has actually looked at the connection between those compounds and decreased incidences of chronic diseases. And so what we're basically seeing is that these different, in this, the next comparison here with all the numbers on the right, they're all positive. These are differences in mineral micronutrients. So a couple of those are macronutrients, but micronutrients in some of the crops. There's a lot of variability, but on average, these regeneratively grown crops in healthier, more fertile soil had more mineral micronutrients. They had more vitamins. They had more phytochemicals. All those things have been related to chronic disease prevention and to essential human health outcomes. There's one more link that we talk about in the book, and that's the link to livestock and animal products, because it turns out that what they eat what cows in particular eat, whether they're eating corn or whether they're grazing on living plants, fundamentally influences their fat profile in terms of the omega-3 and omega-6 ratios. And that's what these graphs show you. On the left, it's the total omega-3 content. The lighter blue bar, the Nourished by Nature one, is our regeneratively raised animals off of one of the farms in our study. The orange one is conventional grain-fed livestock. You'll notice that the omega-3 content of the regeneratively raised stuff of beef and pork is several times higher than the omega-3s in the conventional stuff. And the omega-6 to 3 ratio on the right, there's more omega-6s in the conventional, and there's simple, solid reasons for that. Seeds are full of omega-6s. Grass is full of omega-3s. What your food ate actually matters to what your body gets to work with in teeing up your immune system and your defensive system. So in terms of the take-home messages from what your food ate, it looks like regenerative farming can actually increase topsoil organic matter, by as much as maybe double. That's not good enough for thinking about carbon accounting because you want the whole soil profile, not just the topsoil, but it sure is suggestive. It can increase the phenolics, phytosterols, and carotenoids, mineral micronutrients, vitamins, and a better fat profile in food as well. In other words, there's every reason to actually pay attention to not only what we eat, but how that food was raised. When we think about the problem of human health, it's really complex. Our genes obviously matter, our lifestyle matters, whether you get exercise or not, what you choose to eat matters a lot. But Ann and I want to add another dimension to it, just to complicate things further. What your food ate actually matters to your health. And if you're interested in the science behind all that, obviously I'm totally biased, but I encourage you to check out the new book because we read literally 1,000 research articles and translated them, so you don't have to. But if you're interested, all the sources are on a free online ebook we convinced our publisher to publish and make available to anybody because nobody should ever have to read. Well, if you want to, you should never have to hunt for those papers again. So if you're interested in any of these books, I did bring a few copies of some. I'm heading off to SeaTac to go talk in Boise tonight right after this, but I'll be outside in the lobby if anyone wants to pick up a couple. And if you want the new one, it's available for pre-order wherever you like to get your books. And I believe that I've left time for questions, so I'll stop there and be happy to engage in questions.
All right, we have some time for a few questions. I'm going to kick one off real quick here from the chat, and then I'll turn it over to you, Dennis. Got one here from Caroline, which is kind of an interesting one. You talked about the ingredients in the soil, the quality of the ingredients, but Caroline's question is kind of down to the basics here. Does the quality of our soil change the taste of our food? She really needs to know why most of the grocery store carrots she purchased today taste like radishes.
The short answer is yes. We believe it does, and we outlined all the research we could find relevant to that in the new book. So that's all in there. But what's the connection? Phytochemicals. It turns out that that the mineral micronutrients, phytochemicals, are things that actually, in fact, impact the flavor profile of foods. And the best studies have been done in tomatoes. And yes, those flavorless tomatoes really have less of the stuff that's good for you. Now, there's also a lot of conflict within the nutritional community about what is a nutrient. And most phytochemicals are not classified as nutrients. So why? Because you can survive just fine without them. You can live on flavorless tomatoes. Can you enjoy them? Well, that's personal choice, and it depends how much garlic you put on it, right? But in terms of what's more healthful, what has more health-promoting compounds, what you might consider the preventive medicine aspects of food, the flavorful stuff tends to be better, and there's good science behind it. And as a geologist, I didn't know any of this stuff before researching this book, but that's a wonderful question, and yes, we do go into it in What Your Food Ate.
First question from the audience here from Faith Ireland.
Hi, I'd just like to ask quickly, how are you going to get corporate agriculture to buy into this?
That's a really good question. I'm actually going to give a talk in Boise tonight, and the person that I'm talking with is a farmer. The guy who's had the 2 hands with the really black soil and the neighbor's organic farm, I'm going to go visit with him. He's actually started a company to advise other farmers on how to do what he's done. And they have actually some partnerships with large corporations who have started to get very interested. And there's a very active debate in sort of the agricultural activist world about whether, how serious they are, what's motivating them. And I'm sort of going, Well, they're going to save money because they're going to basically use less of these inputs and they'll be able to market their food as healthier. So it's like, sure, they're going to go for it. There's a challenge in getting the word out, and there's a lot of inertia in the food system, and it's hard to actually steer that ship. But, you know, as a geologist, I think we've got 20 or 30 years to basically radically reform agriculture along these more regenerative lines, and that we're going to reap a human health benefit from it.
After finishing his chicken and vegetables, President Jimmy has a question.
How was that chicken raised?
You know, how can we, and this relates to Faith's question, I think, how can we as Rotarians, other than radically altering how we handle our yard, can we help to encourage more regenerative soil practices?
That's a great question. I don't have a particularly tailored question to Rotarians, but in thinking about supporting the kind of farms that practice that, what Ann and I have done is we've gone to buying a lot of our food at farmers markets where we can actually know what the farmers are doing and that we know and that we like what they're doing. It's difficult to understand that in a grocery store, and the labels that we have there aren't really adequate to it. There's really good organic farms, and there's organic farms that are destroying their soil. One can learn which ones and try and support them. So that's one avenue. Another one is, you know, there has been far too little, I think, political attention paid at the county level, state level. Well, actually, Washington State's pretty good on soil health. There's been some really good initiatives statewide. But in terms of county level and national level policy, you know, the biggest place for anyone interested in influencing policy to influence all this stuff is the Farm Bill that comes up every 5 years. And actually getting Washington State legislators to advocate for citizens on the west side of this state from health interests about why we should care about ag policy is sort of a new dimension. And I've talked with a couple congressional representatives from Western Washington, and they're receptive to it. They don't get a lot of input on that, though. And, you know, in terms of programs, boy, I mean, I'm not sure. I'd be happy to advise on stuff like that, but there's some really good demonstration farms around the world. I visited one in Ghana for writing Growing Revolution that has had a huge impact on the neighborhood there. Helping to establish things like that and get them off the ground could actually have a multiplying effect that would be very much in line with your all's mission.
Next question from one of our amazing sponsors, Bob Alexander.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about large-scale farming, which has some different problems. I would guess that the harvesting of the crop would be about the same expense as it would be in traditional planting. But it's the planting part of it that sounds like it might be a lot more expensive and more labor-intensive.
It's interestingly, John Deere would be happy to sell you a no-till planter that actually cuts down on timing because you only need to drive it across the fields once rather than, you know, in normal tillage operations, it takes several passes. So most of the regenerative farmers I've interviewed find they save time. Some of them, though, if they don't have that no-till planter, there's a massive capital outlay that can be a real barrier to adoption. For many of the farmers I visited in like Ghana, for example, they were small-scale, hand-worked subsistence farms. But the biggest farms I visited for Growing Revolution were 20,000 acres in the Dakotas, and they had done an amazing job with their soil. But it took them, you know, a couple decades to figure out a system that would work for their scale and their equipment and the crops that they can sell. And so one of the things I found to be common around the world was that the actual practices that would be employed were really different, but that the principles translated really well. And I found, you know, as an academic, I found that deeply satisfying. But it's also one of the frustrating things in terms of, you know, how do you actually spread these kind of practices if they have to be learned and tailored and adapted to particular settings? And that's where finding farmers who've been successful already at it and amplifying their message and allowing them to teach their peers is a really good way to do it.
Next we have hello, microphone. Press the button. Dan fangled new technology. In my day, we just used to shout. Next question is from Jim Moore, who has a Zoom question. It's a rather weird one, but it tells us a little bit more about Jim Moore. I didn't know he knew this. His question was, scientists like Alexander von Humboldt identified human degradation of soils in the early 19th century. To what extent are those early observations available or useful to scientists like you today?
The short answer is that you can go even farther back than that. You can go back to the classical Greek philosopher Plato. And I used von Humboldt, I used Plato, I used George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. There's a whole litany of people who've talked about the problem of land degradation in the past. And one of the reasons I actually wrote Dirt is I got and their observations are really valuable to someone like myself in looking back at stuff. I chose to write Dirt as my second popular science book, in part because I had read a book when I was an undergraduate at Stanford back in the 80s called Topsoil and Civilization, written by a couple Soil Conservation Service employees in the 1950s. And I read their 1970s reprint of it. I was fascinated by it. Why did I read it? Well, it was $1 in the bargain book bin, and it was like good reading. But it seems like people just keep forgetting this over and over. And I would argue that there's some original ideas and thoughts in the Dirt book. One that that it's a common pattern, but the basic recognition that the way we treat our land impacts how our descendants will live is not a new idea. It's something we just keep forgetting over and over again. And it's my contention that we can't forget it at a global scale this time around because we have no new places to go.
Next question from Sandy Walsh.
Hi there. My question has to do with essentially gut autoimmune disorders and things like that. Myself, I have ulcerative colitis, and what I'm wondering is I know they're starting to do some research about autoimmune disorders for the gut that may have generational sources, where if there was, say for example, a family that survived the potato famine, that generations later they're finding out that people from that family line may have an autoimmune disorder in common, that kind of thing. What do you think the connection is between the soils and the autoimmune disorders? And then also, like, for example, when I'm over in Europe, I don't have the same issues that I have when I'm here in terms of what I eat and the gut and so on.
Interesting. Yeah, those are really interesting relations that are still, I think, in all fairness, being sorted out. But there's a couple elements there. One, there is evidence of sort of epigenetic effects that can get handed down like you were describing. I'm definitely not an expert in those, but it's really interesting that can work in terms of turning genes on and off, and then the heritability of that. One of the things that turns out to be really central to gut microbiota health, gut microbiota in human health, is what they are eating. So the nature of our diet, and a fiber-rich diet is the best way to try and promote the minimization of those kinds of connections, but they can be really hard to undo once they're established. And what was the other thing that I had a third point I was going to make, but it just flew away.
Well, actually, that's okay because we're out of time, and I want to thank you very much. You made Dirt interesting, dude. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, you did make Dirt a very interesting subject. Thank you for that. I can see why his classes are well subscribed at the UW. So I particularly enjoyed your comment about what you get when you cross a biologist with a geologist, the Dirt. David had told me about Boise, but I think he's a pretty busy fellow, and his travel schedule is beginning to approach pre-pandemic measures, I believe. David, in recognition of your time with Seattle 4, we've contributed to Harvest Against Hunger, a Rotary District 5030 project, as well as a nonprofit that provides healthy meal components to regional food banks. 600 servings of fresh produce, probably acquired through farmer market sources, have been given in honor of your presentation.